The Rebirth of Juan David, a journey of transformation and self-love. Since Juan David was a child, he always felt an overwhelming pressure to excel. His parents, both highly successful in their respective fields, instilled in him the belief that a person's worth was intrinsically tied to their achievements. Throughout his childhood and adolescence, Juan David became a perfectionist. His life was a succession of successes, top grades in school, recognition from his teachers, and a guaranteed spot at the university of his dreams. Everyone admired him, and outwardly, he seemed to enjoy the prestige. However, there was something he never shared with anyone. Despite his success, Juan David never felt truly happy. The satisfaction he experienced was fleeting, as if every accomplishment was just another step on an endless ladder. Every success merely pushed him to seek the next goal, never allowing him to savor the present. There was always a new challenge, a new mountain to climb. The first blow, the fear of failure. When Juan David began his professional career, the expectations intensified. He entered a multinational company as a young executive, and in no time, he was promoted due to his tireless work ethic. However, with success came sleepless nights, the anxiety of meeting ever-growing demands, and the constant pressure to stay on top. While his colleagues went out to celebrate or enjoyed active social lives, Juan David isolated himself. He convinced himself that personal sacrifice was necessary to ensure success. Everything seemed under control until one day, his life took an unexpected turn. After years of absolute dedication to his job, the company where he worked underwent a global restructuring. Juan David, along with many of his colleagues, was laid off without warning. For him, this wasn't just a blow to his career, it was a direct blow to his identity. For so long, he had defined his worth through professional success, and now that his job was gone, he felt as if there was nothing left of him. For weeks, Juan David sank into despair. He woke up each morning with a hollow feeling in his stomach, believing that he had failed not just others, but himself. The fear of the future paralyzed him. He no longer knew who he was if not the successful Juan David. Without his job, he felt purposeless. The journey into the unknown, facing the void. After months of being trapped in depression, something inside him began to stir. It was a small sensation at first, almost imperceptible, but each day it grew stronger, an inner voice telling him that he needed to find answers, but not in the external world. It wouldn't be a new job, a new goal, or a new success that would pull him out of the darkness. This time, the answers had to come from a different place, from within himself. One day, while walking aimlessly through the city, he found himself standing before a sign advertising a spiritual retreat in the countryside. Although his rational side told him it wasn't for him, that same inner voice, now clearer, urged him to sign up. Perhaps, he thought, he needed to distance himself from everything to find what he was looking for. The retreat was a transformative experience from the first day. Juan David found himself surrounded by people who, like him, were seeking answers. The initial sessions were uncomfortable. He had never been in an environment where he was encouraged to look inward, to reflect on his thoughts and emotions without judgment. Slowly, however, he began to open up. He discovered that there was a vast difference between the man he presented to the world and the man he was inside. The encounter with self-love. During one of the retreat's most profound sessions, participants were asked to write a letter to themselves, a letter that no one else would ever read. Juan David sat staring at the blank page for hours, unable to start. What could he possibly say to himself? Until that moment, his life had been a constant race where he was his harshest critic. The idea of speaking to himself with compassion and love felt foreign. Finally, he began to write. The words flowed unexpectedly, as if they had always been there, waiting to be released. He wrote about his fears, his insecurities, about how he had constantly sought external approval without realizing that the only approval he needed was his own. He wrote about the years of self-demand, of how he had refused to allow himself to fail, to be vulnerable. For the first time in his life, he allowed himself to cry for all the weight he had been carrying. That letter was the beginning of his transformation. He started to understand that self-love wasn't just about being kind to himself but about accepting himself as he was, with all his imperfections, with his successes and failures. He realized that he didn't need to prove anything to anyone else, that his worth as a person didn't depend on how successful he was. The path back, rediscovering life. When the retreat ended, Juan David returned to his life with a new perspective. Although the world around him hadn't changed, he had. He began practicing small daily acts of self-care, waking up early to meditate, going for runs in the fresh air, eating mindfully and healthily. But most importantly, he started listening to himself. When he felt the need to rest, he did. When he felt the need to decline an invitation to preserve his energy, he did so without guilt. For months, he worked on building a healthier relationship with himself. He read personal development books, attended therapy, and surrounded himself with people who supported him in his journey towards self-discovery. He learned to find peace in uncertainty, to be okay with not having all the answers, and to accept that life doesn't always follow the plan we set. Reintegration into society, a new Juan David. As he progressed in his inner journey, he also began to rebuild his external life. But this time, he did it from a different place. It was no longer about reaching goals to meet others' expectations, but about finding what truly made him happy. He started exploring new career opportunities, not seeking prestige or money, but something that gave him meaning. He joined a non-profit organization that worked with at-risk youth, teaching them life skills and helping them discover their potential. This work, though not as glamorous as his previous career, gave him deep satisfaction. He discovered that by helping others find their path, he was also continuing to find his own. The complete transformation. A year after being laid off, Juan David was no longer the same man. Not because he had completely changed his external life, but because he had learned to see himself with new eyes. He no longer lived to please others or meet unrealistic expectations. He had found balance between pursuing his dreams and taking care of himself. Every morning, he woke up knowing that his worth didn't depend on what he accomplished that day. He knew that, simply by being who he was enough. Self-love had become the foundation on which he built every aspect of his life. Juan David's legacy. Juan David's story isn't just a story of personal success but a story of redemption. It's the story of a man who got lost in the pursuit of perfection, only to discover something far more valuable, the power of self-love. His journey teaches us that true happiness doesn't come from meeting external expectations but from learning to accept and love ourselves as we are. Today, Juan David shares his story with others, helping people recognize their own worth, embrace their imperfections, and live authentically. His legacy is a reminder that self-love is not a destination but a path we must walk every day. The rebirth of Juan David, a journey of transformation, resilience, and self-love. Since childhood, Juan David had lived under the heavy weight of expectations. His parents, both successful professionals, constantly reminded him of the importance of achievement and perfection. To them, success was everything, and failure was not an option. As a young boy, Juan David absorbed these beliefs, adopting them as his own and striving relentlessly to be the best in everything he did. He became the poster child for excellence, straight A's, top of his class, admired by his peers. Outwardly, his life seemed perfect, a life of privilege, opportunity, and endless potential. But underneath that perfect surface, a storm was brewing. Juan David's self-worth was entirely dependent on external validation, on being the best, on others' admiration, on his long list of accomplishments. With each new achievement, he experienced a fleeting moment of pride, but it was quickly replaced by the anxiety of the next goal. He never allowed himself to stop, to reflect, or to appreciate who he was beyond his achievements. His life was a never-ending race, and he was its only contestant. No matter how fast he ran, he could never catch up to the self-imposed expectations that always seemed just out of reach. The first blow, a world shattered. Years later, as a young man with a flourishing career, Juan David was the definition of success. He worked at a prestigious multinational company, earning accolades and climbing the corporate ladder faster than anyone his age. His parents beamed with pride, his colleagues envied his drive, and his superiors praised his work ethic. Yet, behind closed doors, Juan David's personal life was crumbling. He was constantly exhausted, overworked, and isolated from meaningful relationships. He was so focused on success that he had lost touch with himself. Then, out of nowhere, disaster struck. A sudden corporate restructuring led to massive layoffs, and despite his impeccable track record, Juan David's position was eliminated. The shock was overwhelming. It wasn't just his job that he lost, it felt like he had lost everything: his identity, his purpose, his sense of worth. For the first time in his life, he felt completely powerless. How could this have happened to him? He had done everything right. For weeks, he spiraled into depression. Every morning he would wake up to a crushing sense of dread, feeling like a failure. He questioned everything about his life, his choices, his abilities, even his very existence. How could he face the world now that the very foundation of his identity had been stripped away? The pressure to succeed, which had once driven him, now suffocated him. He saw no future, no hope. The call to transformation, rock bottom. Just when he thought he couldn't sink any lower, Juan David hit rock bottom. One cold, rainy night, he found himself walking aimlessly through the streets, soaked to the bone and exhausted, not caring where he went. He wandered for hours, lost in his thoughts, until he collapsed on a park bench, defeated. The rain masked his tears, but inside, he felt completely broken. He sat there for what seemed like an eternity, staring at the ground, wondering how he had reached this point. In that moment of absolute despair, he asked himself a question he had never dared to ask before: who am I if I'm not successful? That question ignited a flicker of something deep inside him. A realization began to form. He had spent his entire life defining himself by what he achieved, by others' expectations. But what if there was more to him than that? What if he could be more than just his success? For the first time, Juan David considered the possibility that maybe, just maybe, his worth wasn't tied to his accomplishments. Determined to find answers, he sought help. He began attending therapy, something he had once thought was only for the weak. But in those sessions, he began to unravel the complex layers of his identity. He realized that his need for perfection had been a mask, one he wore to protect himself from the fear of inadequacy. Slowly, he began to let go of the idea that he had to be perfect. He began to accept that being human meant being flawed, vulnerable, and imperfect. And for the first time in his life, he started to make peace with that. The turning point, a journey inward. Juan David knew that true transformation wouldn't happen overnight. It would be a long, arduous journey, but he was ready to face it. He enrolled in a spiritual retreat, one that focused on self-discovery and healing. At the retreat, he was introduced to meditation, journaling, and mindfulness practices, things he had never taken seriously before. He was skeptical at first, but as the days passed, something shifted within him. During one powerful session, the retreat leader asked the participants to close their eyes and envision their younger selves, the child within them who longed for love, acceptance, and reassurance. Juan David struggled with the exercise at first, but eventually, he saw it: a young boy, alone in a room, clutching a report card, hoping for validation. That boy was him, his younger self, desperate for approval. And then, like a flood, the emotions came rushing in. He realized how much of his life he had spent trying to prove his worth, not just to others, but to himself. In that moment, Juan David broke down. He wept openly, not out of sadness, but out of release. He wept for the years he had lost chasing an illusion of perfection. He wept for the boy he had once been, the boy who had never felt good enough. And as he cried, he began to forgive himself. He forgave himself for the mistakes, for the failures, for not being perfect. He finally understood that his worth was inherent, that he was enough just as he was. The rebirth, rising from the ashes. After the retreat, Juan David returned home, forever changed. He wasn't the same man who had left. He was lighter, freer, and more at peace with himself. He began to rebuild his life, but this time, from a place of self-love and acceptance. He took up new hobbies, ones he had always wanted to try but had never had the time for. He started painting, not because he was good at it, but because it brought him joy. He began volunteering at a local shelter, helping others who were struggling to find their own worth. And in doing so, he discovered something incredible. By giving to others, he was also giving to himself. Juan David's professional life also took a new direction. He no longer sought high-paying, prestigious jobs. Instead, he pursued work that aligned with his values, that brought him fulfillment. He started his own small business, not for the money or the recognition, but because it allowed him to be creative and to help others. His business wasn't an overnight success, but for the first time in his life, that didn't matter. What mattered was that he was living authentically, true to himself. The legacy of self-love. A year after his life-changing transformation, Juan David stood before a group of young men and women, sharing his story. He had been invited to speak at a local school about the importance of self-love and resilience. As he spoke, he could see the recognition in their eyes, the same fear, the same pressure to succeed that he had once felt. But now, he had a message for them, one that he wished someone had told him years ago. Your worth is not determined by what you achieve. You are enough, just as you are. Success is not the destination, it's the journey. And along that journey, the most important relationship you will ever have is the one with yourself. Love yourself fiercely, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. As he finished his speech, the room erupted in applause. But this time, Juan David didn't feel the need for their approval. He didn't need their validation to know his worth. He had already found it within himself. The unbreakable spirit. Today, Juan David's life is a testament to the power of resilience, self-love, and transformation. He continues to grow, not by chasing external success, but by nurturing his inner world. He has become a beacon of hope for others, showing them that no matter how far they fall, they can rise again. His journey is far from over, but he walks it with confidence, knowing that he is enough, always has been, and always will be. His story is a reminder to us all, no matter how broken you feel, no matter how lost, you can always choose to begin again. You are not your failures. You are not your past. You are worthy of love, especially your own.